What techniques do you use to extract valuable information without revealing too much? So information was a very, very important topic of the first episode in this series. And I want to go back to that because when I think about information in an M&A process, I think about two broad classifications of information. On the one hand, we have information that qualifies the asset. So for example, the fundamentals of the business, the legal constructs and constraints of the company, so on and so forth, right? The information about the asset. And then we have information regarding leverage factors. And your job, whether you're on the buy side or the sell side, is to ferret out as much information as you possibly can while concealing information on your side. So if we think about those broad classifications, we have the asset itself and we have leverage factors. Now, let's think about how do we ferret out information. We can do direct questioning. We can do indirect probing. We can consult third-party information sources, public filings, and individuals, so on and so forth. And then we can observe behavior. And the information qualifying the asset is typically garnered through direct questioning. Right? You can sit down and have a conversation with a seller, for example, about the asset in question. Where it gets more tricky and in some ways just as important as information qualifying the asset is information regarding leverage factors in the negotiations. And while you can do some direct questioning there, you're often better on an indirect basis as well as observing behaviors. And so I want to talk a little bit about that because I don't think I got so into it in segment one of the series. Let's say that you are selling your business and I'm your advisor and we sit down and we say, okay, we're going to start prepping this thing to go to market. And you've got some key account executives here that appear to have deep relationships with some big clients. And if we lose them, they might take business to the competition. What have you done to lock them up? And you look and say, well, we've done a decent job, but we don't have the best contracts in place. And our main guy, he's got another year on his contract, but we probably could do better locking them up. Now, we don't know what buyers are going to do. We haven't started the process yet, but we've identified issues that might cause us some problems later on down the line. Like, so for example, a key account rep decides to take off. That could be particularly negative for our M&A deal. So when we think about ferreting information, let's say the key account exec's name is Jim, right? And Jim's got a year left on his contract. Now, you could go and sit down with Jim and directly begin to question him. You could say, hey, Jim, we're a year out from your contract. I'd like to up this. You've done a great job. Let's renegotiate a contract for you. You could do that. And then you could start asking him questions like, for example, how important is his relationship to account A, B, C? But in the context of the negotiation itself, when you start asking direct questions, that's going to raise some questions in his mind, like, why the heck are you asking me that? And it's going to put you in a position where he could potentially extort you. So I think some things to keep in mind is direct questions are far better when they're materially separated in time and space from a negotiation itself. So it's one thing to sit down with Jim tomorrow night, have a beer with him and say, hey, Jim, let's talk about accounts A, B, and C. Try to garner information as to how important he really is to determine whether or not he's a flight risk. And if he does fly, will he take the accounts with him? You're doing that outside of the construct of a negotiation. So it's not going to raise a lot of red flags. If you want to take a more indirect approach, instead of asking him directly, you might find yourself in a position where, again, you're just doing reviews of the accounts. Maybe you're going to a meeting here and there with him and starting to build the data yourself. You're talking to other folks at the firm, trying to understand how much leverage this guy might have in negotiations. If he catches on to what you're doing, he might turn around and say, hey, why are we renegotiating my contract right now? Are you selling the business now? For fuck's sake, that puts you in a horrible position because now you're either forced to tell him the truth, which is going to put him in a position of tremendous leverage, or you're going to lie to them, which would be a horrible thing to do because, on the one hand, it's unethical. On the other hand, you might even be opening yourself up from a legal perspective. If you lie to him and he relies on that, it could potentially be fraudulent inducement. So you want to stay out of direct questioning in the middle of an actual negotiation. And so if we take this to a broader M&A context perspective, when I start to think about leverage factors, the types of things I'm trying to determine is necessity, desire, time pressure, who's got what at stake for doing a deal. And I find that a lot of the indirect probing at the very early onset of a deal is probably where you're going to make your money. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're running a sell-side process and you, the seller, want to understand as much as you can about the buyer and their motivations and their capacity to pay. You're going to want to do that over dinner and drinks, maybe the night before a formal meeting. You're going to want to have a lot of indirect conversation. And this is why I always advise clients, do a lot of listening, ask a lot of questions, be very careful from what you reveal, because the buyer is going to be trying to find out the same information. The buyer is going to try to figure out if you've got an important trip coming up that you got to take. So you need to get a deal done at a certain point in time. That your wife just retired and wants to move to another country. There's a lot of things that you can inadvertently reveal, which will shift leverage from you on the sell side to the buy side. So direct probing, indirect questions, third party. Another way to, of course, ferret out information, one of the most important, is basically by observation. And that observation takes place within the construct of the formal deal process, how people react to things, how aggressive they are, how non-aggressive they are. You can kind of start to garner how important the deal is based upon how people interact with you and the signals that they give you within the process. So I always say to myself, and for years, every time I start a process, I've got what's a mental checklist. It used to be a written checklist, but now it's a mental checklist for me, for each and every different buyer that we deal with. What is the pertinent information regarding the leverage factors that I'm trying to get? And what sort of questions will I ask in order to get that information to help me decide what sort of leverage and what is the disparity of desire between my client, the seller, and each individual buyer?